Hello, everyone. My name is Todd McGrath. I'm a vice president at the Medical Research Network. I oversee the global project management team, and I head up the US and Oceana operations. Tell you about myself, I have over 16 years of experience working in the life sciences industry, starting off in consulting and then moving into clinical systems, information systems, including randomization and trial supply management, clinical trial supply management, IXRS, the IVR, IWR, and ePro. And then as for the last 5 years at the Medical Research Network, gaining a lot of experience in the delivery of home trial support services, in which we take a clinical trial to the patient by conducting visits in their home. I hope that with my experience, I can help you in your strategic plan and your approach to decentralized clinical trials. Who are MRN? It's a medical research network. And to give you a bit of background, we've been in the industry for over 14 years, and that's 14 years of experience in delivering remote visits, clinical trial visits being done in the home through the use of a nurse. We have offices in the UK, US, Spain, and Germany. We've done 150 plus clinical trials, done 40,000 plus visits. On any month, we're doing 400 plus visits that we're doing remotely in the home. We do specialize in rare disease clinical trials, those clinical trials that are complex. And we're able to do that because we have an experienced staff at MRN, from the senior management consisting of medics, pharmacists, registered nurses. 47% of our MRN employees have worked in the industry, and they've worked in clinical research organizations on the sponsor side and at the site. When using our services, we see upwards of 95% patient retention rates. As industry leaders in decentralized clinical trials for over 14 years, we can deliver the complex efficiently by helping patients in their community globally. I think it's important that when we start thinking about the strategic approach to decentralized clinical trials, that we have to start looking at the clinical trial landscape, where we're at today. As I'm demonstrating on this graph here and looking at it overall, the global R&D spending is projected to grow at 119 billion by 2024. Phase 3 segment dominated the global clinical trials market with a share of 53% in 2019. And the Phase 2 segment followed the Phase 3 in terms of market share, accounting for 19.8 in 2019. This trend continues to be projected to spend moving forward. This growth in R&D spend takes a number of factors into account. There's an increasing prevalence of chronic disease and growing demand for clinical trials in developing countries. The demand for the developing countries is fueling the market growth. There's a rising number of biologics and a need for personalized medicines and orphan drugs. And then we also, as we're all facing now, is the emergence of a global pandemic, coronavirus. What impact has COVID-19 really had on the clinical trial market? The COVID-19 pandemic has clearly highlighted the weakness of a traditional site-centered clinical trial design. This year, we've seen a number of large pharma organizations announce changes to their upcoming and ongoing studies, including one large pharma company that announced a halt to their enrollment in their ongoing studies and a delay to the launch of any new trials. This is an incredible announcement, especially considering their normal R&D spend is over 5.5 million. We've also seen new patient enrollment figures showing 65% global decrease year over year, an 84% reduction in India, a 43% decrease in Japan, and the US is down 67%. And looking at the graph on the right of the slide, this shows the revised global revenue forecast following on from the pandemic. This demonstrates a $20 billion deficit with 53.5% of trials suspended, 14.2% terminated, and 32.3% withdrawn. Some of the factors we know are affecting this is on the sponsor side, trying to ramp up and create hybrid clinical trials for ongoing trials. We know this is going to be a challenge for them. We know there's growing pains to that. We also have seen there's unavailability of a treatment-naive patients. There's a lack of researchers and physicians. They've had to refocus their attention to the treatment of COVID patients, and clinical trial studies in patients have actually become a second priority. Clinical trial budgets have been affected by the pandemic as well. Sites are having to close to ensure patient safety, and patients are nervous about going back to sites even if they're open. The traditional clinical trial model is under increasing pressure, and more people are discussing decentralized clinical trials. While COVID has certainly increased the challenges, these challenges aren't all due to COVID. The estimated cost and time for site activation are approximately $30,000 and 100 days retrospectively. This is a huge expense, particularly if those sites don't deliver patients that you need. We know that currently 70% of patients in clinical trials participating live more than 2 hours from the study center. And we know that patients find long distance travel into the sites an inconvenience. Over the years, clinical trials have only gotten more complex. The number of assessments have only increased. Patients find them to be a challenge to participate. They're not incentivized, and they find them to be a burden. And this leads to 85% of clinical trials failing to recruit enough patients, and 80% of clinical trials being delayed due to recruitment problems. This means a longer time to complete the trial and ultimately getting the drug to the market. We know that patient recruitment and retention rate has an impact on the cost of your trials. The delays are estimated to result in capital losses of $8 million per day for a blockbuster drug. We also know that with the use of decentralized clinical trial, recruitment rates increase by 60% plus, and it maintains patient retention rates upwards of 95%. Considering decentralized clinical trials is a strategic choice that needs to be made based on the protocol and the patient requirements. With decentralized clinical trials, we see a number of key benefits. Patients find participation easier, sites see increased and faster recruitment rates, and sponsors are able to recruit patients from a much wider geographical area, which leads to drugs entering the market quicker and more efficiently. But it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's important to understand that when conducting a clinical trial and you're doing research visits in a community, it's not as simple as just sending out a nurse to the home. It's more complicated than that. At MRN, we manage and coordinate the entire process. As you can see from this diagram, there is a lot to be considered. When working with MRN, we're going to manage and we're going to coordinate the entire process through equipment, samples, and IMP management. This is all done in coordination with the site, with the nurse, the patient, with our vendors, and especially with you as the sponsor. It is complex, but our experience and our expertise ensures we deliver the complex process efficiently for our customers. I think one of the things that MRN always is focused on, as you see in the beginning, in the center of this graph, is that you're focused on a patient. All the other things around it are the complexities. That's the burden, and that's what MRN takes on. We make sure that we take care of those things seamlessly so that the patient never experiences this, never understands the complexities of it. The feedback that we receive from our customers, and especially I think to share, is that MRN are incredibly flexible and collaborative to work with. So how do you deliver these decentralized clinical trials? There's a number of questions you need to consider, and you have to do this early on. It's better to be proactive when looking at your protocols and setting up your clinical trials rather than being reactive, like we've seen in some instances with the pandemic. So what does your protocol entail? We always are looking at it as the schedule of assessments and how those schedule of assessments can be broken down to see what activities can be delegated to a nurse, and perhaps using a combination approach and solutions to provide visits in the home. We talk about this a lot in our industry today. We talk about hybrid models. Well, we know that we can look at the schedule of assessments and we can look at those visits. And we know sometimes that nurses can go out and perform the majority of those visits. our general rule is that they can be supplied, they can carry supplies, and they carry a piece of equipment, they can do the visit in the home. In most cases, they can. However, we know that we can't do all of the visits. And there's always going to be that need for the physician or a clinical site. In those instances, and by example, when they have to go back for MRI or for scans, those will be site visits. In other cases, you might be able to use technology, using wearable devices to collect data, or using telemedicine. And at any given point, you can do a combination of those things, where you have a nurse at the patient's home for the human touch element of the clinical trial, but they may be working with a physician through a video, through telemedicine. And these are all extremely beneficial when you're delivering your clinical trial. But if you think about it, some of these trials, when there's weekly visits that are required, they're very complex. It's high burden, for the patient. But if you could take the vast majority of those visits and you do those in the home, and that patient only has to go back to site maybe every month, every 3 months, or every 6 months, right away, you're creating a more attractive clinical trial that ultimately is going to allow you to recruit and have higher retention rates. The other thing you want to do is just consider the patients, right? Who are your patient? Who's the patient population? What's the disease area? We want to be thinking about those patients that have compromised immune systems, just going back and traveling to the sites. Or I was talking earlier about the 2 hours that they might have to travel. In some cases, though, just for rare diseases alone, just to get to a specialist, they might have to go across state borders. They might have to do overnight stays. They might have to take flights. And you could see already just to get to the care and to get to the actual treatment becomes such a burden for them. So if we can start taking back some of those visits and putting them into the patient's home where it's convenient for them, again, it's going to be more attractive to them. So what is the treatment? That's another thing to consider. What's the mode of administration? Our nurses have gone out and they've done infusions at home, they've done subcutaneous injections, and they've done oral administration. We do complex clinical trials, and that's what we specialize in. In some cases, you might, due to the stability of the drug itself, perhaps that drug has to be reconstituted at the site, and it has to be shipped under controlled conditions. It's important that you're working with a premium courier so that you have the ability to have controlled shippers and temp tails. In some cases where perhaps the stability of that drug does not allow for long durations of time in travel, it's important that you start thinking about central pharmacies. MRN can set up central pharmacies that are in closer proximity to a patient so they can still receive that treatment. We do have other cases where our nurses have actually prepared the drug in the patient's home and they've administered to the patient. We have situations where our nurses have self-injected, or they do the subcutaneous injection, and they will show the patient over the course of the trial how they will be able to self-inject, and then they'll only go back for visits to do compliance checks. And all these things are available and something to be considered when looking at a protocol. The other thing to take in consideration is one of our recommendations over the years is just the first-in-man trials, the first-in-patient trials that we always recommend. Those first 3 doses are performed at the clinic for safety reasons, to have that observation. But once those those visits are done in the first 3 doses, they can start doing the visits in the home again. So who and what do you need to conduct a research visit? And I think that's important as well. There's a lot of things to take into consideration. We do have various pieces of technology out there today that we can do these visits. I know our MRN, we have MRN Smart, a technology, or pen technology that we use to record visit report forms, which contain anything from information that regarding the vitals, the concomitant medications, AEs, SAEs, the mode of administration, and they'll also report back to the sites following that visit to make sure that they understand that the visit went successfully. Also, there's the compliance checks that they can perform. and that is on the data that they might be using through other wearable devices and making sure that the recording of information is accurate by the patient. There's all these things you want to take into consideration when we're actually looking at how you conduct that research visit. What countries are going to be involved? And is there specific country regulations that you need to consider? We do work globally in over 40 plus countries. We have a team that specializes in the management of vendors in these countries, and we have a dedicated network of country managers that are an extension of MRN. They work to the same controlled processes of MRN in our same quality management system. They speak the language and they're familiar with the local regulations. And I think this is really key as you start looking at your clinical trials and you start working in these various countries. Oftentimes you want to work with someone like MRN that has the expertise and can provide you with the information to consult with you to better prepare in your protocol designs. I think it's really important that you take into the things that we're talking about into the consideration of your protocol development and further into your informed consents and your patient information sheets. You do want to make sure that you have your protocols have the appropriate language, that there are not only going to be clinical visits, but there might be alternative visits to allow you to do visits in the home, perhaps at a school, perhaps you could do this at a place of work. You also want to make sure that you have in your informed consents is that information will be shared with a third party, and that the patient identifiable information will be archived and protected in the appropriate manner. But most importantly, it needs to be used as in a full portfolio approach to get the best payout by increasing the recruitment and attention of patients and ultimately getting drugs to market faster and more efficiently. So just to summarize on what we've discussed today, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. You need to consider all patient and clinical trial circumstances. A completely virtual trial will and can't be the solution for all protocols. You need to be thinking about your entire schedule of assessments and looking at it going, what kind of approach can we take that is a combination of possible options? And that might be the nurse. It might be instances where the patient has to go back to site, or there might be instances where you might be using telehealth, or perhaps a combination of nurse with patient and physician through a telehealth visit. You also might be using wearable devices or other pieces of technology in order to collect data. But all of these things can be used to create a successful clinical trial that allows patients to be seen in their homes and to reduce the overall burden for them. These centralized clinical trials have to be used strategically, not as a risk mitigator. We've seen this in COVID. We've seen this during the pandemic. A lot of the times when they wanted to continue care and suddenly the patients were too nervous to go back to site, or those clinics shut down, the first thing everyone wanted to do was go, how do I continue care for these patients? But if you use this strategically, you'll gain so much more. You'll be able to be more proactive than reactive. And furthermore, just looking at the overall return on investment and the value for your project, to be truly efficient, decentralized trial should be included as part of the original protocol. So you do have to start early, and you have to start thinking about these things. Patients want to be in decentralized clinical trials. Now that patients have been given more access to the decentralized clinical trial model and research visits have been conducted in the community, they'll continue to work. And those patients will fight and advocate for decentralized research visits to become their standard of care. And we have the retention rates to back that up. The details in decentralized clinical trials are complex, but with the right expertise and systems, they can be delivered safely and efficiently, providing you and the patients with significant benefits. I hope the information that I shared with you today will help you in your strategic approach to decentralized clinical trials. So thank you very much for your time. But if you do have any questions, please reach out to us. Get in touch with us so we can address those with you. Thank you. Have a great day.